Hey guys, it's the Villaman here, and you know exactly what day it is. Today is comparison day, and we'll be comparing the LG C10 OLED to the Samsung Q90T QLED. Now we're going to be comparing the screen performance and picture quality, but I think this year's comparison will be a bit different for other reasons also. Now this year the Q90T only has a quarter of the local dimming zones that last year's model have, and it has an 8-bit panel plus FRC versus a 10-bit panel of the Q90R last year. While the LG TV uses the same panel as last year's model but with some updated processing. Now the question is, will those affect real-world performance, or will both TVs perform as they have in the past or even better? Well, stick around. Now, if you're new to the channel, here we do reviews, demos, and comparisons of the audio and video tech that entertains you. So you can find the best devices and get the most out of them. So you know what that means. You have to subscribe. I mean, I didn't make the rules, we just have to follow them. So this video, like all my videos, will be in 4K HDR. So for the best viewing experience, make sure to watch on an HDR compatible device like your newer iPhone and Android devices or your 4K HDR TVs. Don't forget to check out the merch store for awesome home theater t-shirts like this one and more. They're really good. They're pretty cool. Oh, and for those curious, both TVs are on their latest firmware, so that's 3.11.25 for the OLED and 1.4.02 for the QLED. Alright, so I've included timestamps in the description if you want to skip around in the video for parts that are relevant to you, but without further ado, let's get into it. Now this is not only a good test of backlight management because of the many point brightness elements on the dark background, but it's also a good test of whether the TV has any black crush. And the first thing you notice is the uneven presentation on the Q90T, where the middle part of the screen is darker than the edges. The stars are also not as bright on the QLED as they are on the OLED, and the test actually finishes sooner and starts later on the QLED than it does on the OLED, which is an indication of some black crush happening. This is a very difficult test for an LCD TV, as we're able to see. The source, as always, is the Spears & Munsell benchmark disc, and the output is set to a max of 2000 nits, so both TVs will have to tone map the brightness of any scene that is higher than what the TV can support natively. And in this next test, we see where both TVs don't do a very good job of representing the brighter portions of this test. The two final zones in this test lack the definition that they should have and are instead represented as one bigger zone with the same brightness. The darkest zones, however, do have definition between the two darkest points. Next, we'll test for posterization using the 8-bit and 10-bit sources in the quantization artifacts test. Now, the aim of this test is to see just how well the TVs can smooth a gradient, and posterization is when you can see the steps in the gradient, so we don't want that. Here we see that both TVs have trouble with an 8-bit source, which we can see the posterization, but they both do pretty well with the 10-bit source, although the Samsung does better than the LG does in maintaining a smoother gradient. Next, we'll test both TVs' ability to smooth out the motion of fast-moving objects by setting each TV's motion smoothing to maximum. Without the setting enabled on either TV, we can see that the objects are barely legible, but once enabled and set to maximum, everything becomes a lot more legible. The side effect of that, though, are twofold: motion artifacting on the edges of objects and the soap opera effect, both of which can be very distracting. The LG, though, creates a lot more artifacts than the Samsung does. That said, the Q800T still has the best motion enhancement I've seen so far with the least amount of artifacting. Next, we'll use the running peppers test to test both blooming and judder. Now I've increased the exposure of the camera just so we can see how much blooming is created by the bright peppers on the dark background on the QLED TV. Now this test creates judder on the OLED, while on the QLED it creates blooming because of the bright object on the dark background, and also because of the object panning across the screen, which on an OLED TV, because of the way they handle motion, appears as judder. The issue on the C10 can be fixed by enabling the de-judder setting, but on the Q90T, the blooming cannot be fixed because it's inherent to LCD technology. This next motion interpolation test shows that neither TV has an issue with 3:2 pull down, as the panning is smooth on both TVs. Next, we'll compare how both TVs handle luminance loading as the size of the bright window is increased. The Samsung now does a better job than it did previously with its older firmware, but you can still see the brightness fluctuations as different backlight zones are enabled. The OLED, on the other hand, does also have fluctuations in brightness as the size of the screen gets larger. If we speed the video up, then we can see just how much this happens. This next 15% full field gray test shows that there is some panel uniformity issues on the Q90T. The TV does have some clouding, and the OLED appears to have some slight dirty screen effect. These issues though don't show up in the other full field test. Alright, now let's get to the video quality comparison. Both TVs are in their most accurate picture modes, that's movie mode for the QLED and cinema mode for the OLED. They're also both being fed by a Samsung UB820 Blu-ray player that's then split through a Denon X4700H HDMI 2.1 receiver. So the differences you see will be a direct result of each TV's picture processing. The first difference you notice between the two TVs is just how much brighter the Q90T is than the LG C10. In fact, the QLED gets so bright that even though I'm filming in HDR, the brightness of the TV exceeds the dynamic range of the camera, which results in some clipping in the brighter detail in some scenes. So in scenes where the brighter portions of the screen seems overblown and lack detail is a result of the camera being clipped and not able to capture all that dynamic range. That said, both TVs render a very vivid picture. Though the LG does render a more contrasty scene than the Q90 does, in certain brighter scenes, that difference in contrast may not be that readily apparent. The LG C10 has a peak brightness of around 750 nits, while the Samsung Q90T has a peak brightness of around 1200 nits, so that difference in brightness output can be seen in brighter scenes. The Samsung TV also tends to maintain a higher average scene brightness than the LG does. The colors on both TVs are also very close. There isn't as big a difference as we saw in the LG OLED versus the Vizio OLED comparison. Although there is some loss in the specular highlight detail in the brighter portions of the image on the Q90T, like the brightest parts of the clouds you see here. The difference in brightness between both TVs is amplified when compared directly like this, but I think it's important to know that your eyes will adjust to the brightness of the TV. So whether it's bright in your room or dim, your eyes will adjust to normalize the image. So in a dark room, the brightness of either TV won't be much of an issue since both TVs have features to adjust the brightness depending on the ambient light of your room. Instead, what's important in a dark room is the TV's ability to get dark, and the OLED will have a natural advantage in that regard since each individual pixel can turn on and off as necessary, while the Samsung only has a limited number of zones to control the brighter and darker portions of the screen. So blooming will be evident in a dark room when watching the Samsung Q90T, but that will not be the case when watching an OLED TV like the LG C10. And as I've noted before, the important factor here would be the contrast difference, and it's further amplified by this side-by-side comparison. And although the OLED doesn't have quite the brightness that the QLED does, it still maintains some great specular highlight details, but what it does have is the absolutely lowest of lows when it comes to black levels, and in a dark room, that makes it that much better. In contrast, although the QLED doesn't have the pixel level control of the backlight, it does get pretty dark in a dark room, but it still maintains some blooming around bright objects. Where its strength lies is in bright room performance. Since the QLED can get so bright and its anti-reflective properties so good, then it can perform absolutely great in a bright room. This has been true for years and it continues to be the case. What has changed over the years though is the number of local dimming zones in the Q90. Previously in the Q90R there were over 490 local dimming zones, while in the Q90T there are only about 120. That is something which has affected the darkroom performance and has also led to more blooming in those challenging scenes. Both TVs also have the Filmmaker Mode, which is a new picture mode which is a feature of the newer TVs. So now we can compare both TVs using the exact same picture mode and the result is the same. Both TVs have a similar color palette, but the contrast and brightness advantage of the OLED and QLED respectively is still quite evident. The higher contrast of the OLED also leads to a higher perceived saturation of the colors. Now let's look at the picture quality difference between movie mode and game mode using the same source, so we can see what we give up in terms of picture quality when enabling game mode. So on the left will be the movie mode and on the right of each TV will be the game mode. And both TVs actually perform very well. There isn't much of a contrast or color shift while enabling game mode. The midtones on the QLED are boosted though, which makes the skin tones appear brighter than they would otherwise. tell you what, that was a lot of filming. Now, as I mentioned, the biggest difference between both of these TVs is the contrast performance, but that's pretty much a given considering their technologies, OLED versus LCD, which an OLED TV will always have better contrast than an LCD TV. The issue with that is both of these TV technologies have their respective strengths. So the strength of an LCD TV is its peak brightness level, while the strength of an OLED TV is its black level. And depending on your room and your use case, you have to decide which one of those is more important to you. Now, if you have a light controlled room, then the OLED TV will be the better option because it just has a better and more contrasty and punchier picture. And if you have a brightly lit room with a lot of ambient lighting or windows with sunlight coming in, then the QLED may be the better option because of its high peak brightness and its better anti-reflective coating on the screen. But the performance and picture quality is as I've shown. They both look absolutely gorgeous, but they indeed have their strengths, which will play out in each of these scenarios that I just mentioned. Now, the Samsung is said to have a lower input lag than the LG does, but that wasn't always the case. Now, in the video portion, the QLED was ahead of the OLED because of its lower input lag, but in the test tone portion, the OLED was ahead of the QLED, which is interesting because they were both 4K HDR signals. One was just 60 frames per second, while the other one was 24 frames per second. In game mode, both TVs elevate the midtones, the Samsung more so, in order to aid the shadow detail, which has the added effect of brightening skin tones also. Make sure to come back for the high frame rate FreeSync gaming comparison between these two TVs, which will be live in a few days. Now, I'm sure you saw that specific test where the object on the screen appeared to have judder on the OLED, specifically the running peppers test, as I call it. Now, in certain instances like those, objects on OLEDs can appear to have judder, but that's because of the way the screen handles motion. And to solve that, you'll have to enable the LG's de-judder setting, but doing that may result in some motion artifacting because of the picture processing that the LG does, which results in some artifacting on the edges of objects. The OSs of both TVs are super intuitive, smooth, and have a lot of relevant apps. Usability is also good because the remote control of both TVs can control attached HDMI devices. So let me know your thoughts in the comments and which one of these TVs you think is right for you and your room. Don't forget to like the video if you liked it and subscribe if you haven't. Thanks for watching, and until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood Villaman saying be safe and peace.